Citizen Sleeper was a game that I was immediately drawn to by the name, the cover art, and the premise. I read the concept was that you play as a homeless robot trying to survive on a desolate space station, and that sounded incredible. Watching gameplay, however, my expectations did start to simmer slightly, as I saw that the majority of what you would do would involve dice rolls and talking to NPCs. This wasn't what I was expecting, but then again I didn't know what to expect with Disco Elysium, and that ended up being one of my favourite titles of all time, so I went in with an open mind. In Citizen Sleeper you play as the titular Sleeper, a sort of android lifeform with the mind and memories of a human being that had to give up their original organic body for unknown reasons. You awaken on an isolated space station called The Eye, with no friends, no money, and nowhere to stay. From here, you must do your best to try to survive day to day, which is measured by two separate stats, your condition and your energy. Immediately adding a sense of impending doom as these two stats are constantly degrading and you must do everything you can to stop them from hitting zero. And I was all in for this setup, the idea of having a character start from nothing in a hostile environment, building themselves up with the help of sympathetic characters, all whilst dealing with the mysterious and yet unresolved past. This was exactly the kind of adventure I had been looking for. Not long after this setup was introduced, however, I started to become a bit more wary about where the game was headed. As previously mentioned, the majority of what you actually do is roll dice and talk to NPCs. Rolling dice is how you carry out the various tasks that get requested of you. The number of dice you have is dependent on how high your condition is. The lower your condition, the less dice you have available, and therefore the fewer actions you can take in a day. And how well you carry out those tasks is decided on the outcome of your dice rolls. So whether you're delivering food, loading cargo, or gambling credits, you're always rolling dice and hoping for the best possible outcome. And this is where the game lost me for a little bit the first time. The game was developed by a small, seemingly one-person team, so I fully understand that I shouldn't expect all the bells and whistles of a AAA title. But there is such little variety and feedback after every action that it can be hard to get immersed. You can be carrying out construction on a spaceship, have a dice roll with an awful outcome, and all that happens is that your energy stat drops and you get a generic sentence of text talking about how it's been a hard day at work. Or you can be working in a peaceful commune helping to plant new crops, roll the dice, get a great outcome, and all you'll see is your condition increase slightly and get a bit of text saying it's been a really good day of farming. There are so few variables at risk with each action that it doesn't really feel like you're doing much of anything at times. But I didn't stop playing. Why is that? Mainly I was curious to see where the story would go. Because you start out as such a blank slate, the directions the story could go in seem infinite. Are you going to try and carve out a prosperous life in the Eye, or will you try to escape? Will the all-powerful conglomerate that made you a sleeper come and find you, or will you reclaim your organic body? Will you spend the rest of your days as a shambling loner, or will you make real connections and potentially even find love? All of these options at one point or another seemed to have real potential, and it was the driving force that kept me playing, just to see how things would pan out. Throughout the game you encounter numerous characters, each with their own story and motivations and issues. It's through these folks that you get your quests as well as the resources you need to survive another day. Now, I'm not a writer, so I feel bad about criticising this next part, but a lot of the writing for these characters felt lacking. The most glaring issue is that many of these characters had the same kind of arc. They're initially hostile and then friendly, but then it turns out that they're bad. But then there's a revelation that they're actually good but got caught up with the wrong crowd. It felt like the game was too scared to have some truly bad people in it, or was trying to show that everyone is complex and layered and we shouldn't judge people on first glance. Whatever the intended effect, the reality is that a lot of the characters simply weren't memorable. By the end there was only one character that I truly cared for, which is at least something I guess, and getting to see that character's ending did bring me some satisfaction. Which brings me onto the ending itself, or rather the endings themselves. Citizen Sleeper has several different conclusions that are dependent on the player's choices. And when I say that, I don't mean like how other games do it where if the player chooses to murder the entire population of a small town, they are given the bad ending. I mean it is literally, do you want to do A or do you want to do B, but repeated about 7 times throughout the story. That's right, throughout the story. Depending on what the player chooses, the game can end several hours earlier, with the player straight up missing significant chunks of the later story. And I like this approach. Having a game end at a natural point based on the player's decision, and not padding it out or delaying the ending just to satisfy a minimum amount of playtime, was nice. That said, there were 2 quirks that I didn't care for. Firstly, after a choice is made that results in an ending, the credits will roll, but then the game will continue. Not completely weird, plenty of games have allowed the player to carry on playing after the credits have rolled before. But in Citizen Sleeper, the credits will roll, you carry on playing, and you can then finish another questline that will lead to another ending. And then you're shown the credits. Again. So you can end up in a weird place where you watch the credits 3 or 4 times in one sitting. And the second quirk, the final ending isn't signalled as the final ending. The credits roll, you're thrown back into the game, but there's nothing left to do. No questlines to complete, no characters to talk to, and nothing to do. You're just left there staring into the void. Which does feel a little sloppy, as it wasn't until some time later that I realised there was no more game left to play and I'd just been wasting my time. In fact, there is a general lack of polish across the entire game. Again, I know, solo developer, living the dream, not able to work out every kink, etc, etc. But some of these things are hard to ignore. First up, there were several spelling mistakes. This is kind of important not to have in such a text-heavy game. There were other grammatical errors and times when I could select things that weren't on the screen and lose my cursor in the process, and 2 instances of the game completely crashing on me. It took me a moment to understand what had happened because it had been so long since I'd had a game crash on me like that. But the biggest issue, and the reason why I think Citizen Sleeper doesn't quite hold up, is the lack of agency. It is devoid of any real player choice or decision making, and once you get past all of the smoke and mirrors, you realise you're essentially ticking a linear list of boxes whilst doing a bit of extra reading. Now, if we are to get a little abstract here, yes, a lot of video games are presented in such a way as to give you an illusion that something of greater significance is happening than what you are actually playing. But in Citizen Sleeper it feels uncomfortably noticeable. Because there is so little else going on, in terms of story, visuals, gameplay or sound, you can't help but notice that you're progressing in a very defined, purposeful direction, set by someone else. And your choices don't really matter or have any real effect. This becomes obvious when selecting dialogue options. There was one moment where a scene involved myself with a gun, an ally and a villain. 2 options came up, retreat with the ally or shoot the villain. I chose to shoot the villain to see if the game had the balls to go through with it, and it didn't. I selected the option, my character goes to raise their gun, and all of a sudden my ally puts their hand on my shoulder and says, "Let's go, this guy isn't worth it." Really? Because I was about to shoot him dead a second ago, so he's clearly worth something. What is the point of giving a player some player choice if you don't let that choice be fulfilled? It's meaningless. And sadly, that's the feeling I finished the game with. It all felt pretty hollow and inconsequential. I will always champion small teams and indie games, but I do also still want them to be good. Looking at other reviews for this game, I'm starting to worry that I'm either a contrarian or completely mad, since everyone else seems to love it. So maybe check it out if you're into isolationist sci-fi settings, or you feel like the average visual novel doesn't have enough interactivity, but feel like Tetris has a bit too much. I mean, if it kept someone like me that didn't actually enjoy it, occupied for 10 plus hours, then I'm sure it will keep a genuine fan of this kind of thing busy for at least the next decade. Thank you for watching. If you've made it to the end, please subscribe for more videos on obscure indie games that everyone else loves and I absolutely do not love. Cheers!